what happened in the last 24 hours was not a border incident, not a minor miscalculation, and not the kind of event that can be walked back with a diplomatic statement. What happened in southern Israel last night was the kind of event that enters military history almost immediately. Before sunrise, 500 EMAD ballistic missiles were launched from Iranian territory in coordinated, sequential ways. The targets were not symbolic sites or exposed frontier positions. They were among the most heavily defended and operationally critical military facilities in the southern Israeli theater. The central strike hit IDF Southern Command, the command and control hub that has directed major Israeli ground operations in the south for roughly 2 decades. The complex was struck with enough precision and repetition that by the end of the attack, almost nothing functional remained. 3 major military bases were also hit in repeated waves. These bases housed armored logistics, signals intelligence infrastructure, and forward airfield support. By the time the strikes ended, the damage was being described not as temporary disruption, but as the destruction of core operational capacity. That distinction matters. IDF Southern Command was not an improvised field position. It was a hardened, layered, deeply defended command complex, representing years of institutional planning, operational integration, and accumulated military experience. The personnel inside that command structure were part of the system that turns intelligence, planning, logistics, and battlefield coordination into military effectiveness. That kind of architecture cannot be replaced by a quick shipment of equipment or a public show of Allied support. What was lost took years to build, and rebuilding it could take years more. In Washington, the initial reaction has reportedly gone far beyond routine concern. The public language has been careful, broad, and noticeably less precise than usual. In crises like this, vagueness often signals something important. Decision makers are still trying to understand the scope of the damage and the implications of what has just happened. The phone lines between Tel Aviv and Washington have been active without interruption. Public statements have emphasized support, restraint, and ongoing assessment. But when officials who normally speak in exact terms begin pleading on generalities, it usually means the internal picture is still incomplete. At the center of this story are 4 questions, and none of them can be answered with slogans. The first question is technical and operational. How did 500 ballistic missiles penetrate one of the most expensive and extensively tested air defense architectures in the world with enough effectiveness to destroy 3 major military installations and disable a theater-level command structure? For years, sanctions were described as steadily degrading Iran's military capability, yet the guidance, coordination, and strike discipline demonstrated by the EMAD missiles in this attack do not align with the image of a decaying program. They suggest a missile force that has continued to develop, improve, and mature. That leads directly to the second question. Why did the air defense architecture fail at this scale? Israel's integrated defensive system includes Arrow 3, David's Sling, and Patriot PAC-3. Publicly, this layered structure has long been presented as capable of handling large ballistic missile threats. Last night, however, 3 major military installations were devastated. The reason for that failure matters enormously. If the problem was primarily magazine depth, that points to a severe but finite resupply issue. If the problem was that the EMAD's maneuvering reentry vehicle created tracking and engagement challenges that current interceptors could not solve reliably, then the issue is far deeper and much harder to correct on a short timeline. The third question concerns Washington's real decision space. A carrier strike group in the eastern Mediterranean is a visible symbol of American commitment. But symbols and capability are not the same thing, and the public deserves a clear distinction between what that force can do and what reversing the damage of last night would actually require. The fourth question is the most important in strategic terms. What does this event mean for the regional order built around American-backed security guarantees? The Abraham Accords, Gulf security planning, and the broader architecture of American-aligned stability in the Middle East all rest on one foundational assumption: that American deterrence, combined with Israeli military capacity, remains credible enough to anchor the system. When that credibility is challenged, this visibly regional actors begin recalculating, often quietly at first, and then all at once. The operational details help explain why this attack had such an outsized effect. The EMAD missile belongs to a development line built over decades of Iranian aerospace work. It is a medium-range ballistic missile, but the characteristic that matters most here is its maneuvering reentry vehicle. That feature changes the engagement problem dramatically. A purely ballistic missile follows a largely predictable arc. With adequate tracking data and enough reaction time, an interceptor can be placed on a collision path. A maneuvering reentry vehicle changes its terminal path during the final phase of descent, when defenders have the least time to adapt. That means the final engagement window becomes shorter, more complex, and less predictable. Even a strong defensive architecture can be stressed heavily if enough missiles arrive in the right sequence. And sequence appears to have been central to this operation. The 500 missiles did not simply arrive all at once. They came in timed waves designed to test, stress, and then overwhelm the defensive layers. The first salvos appear to have forced rapid engagement decisions and started depleting interceptor stocks. Follow-on waves then arrived during the periods when batteries were reorienting, processing new tracks, or facing reload limitations. By the final waves, the defense was operating with a degraded engagement picture and fewer available interceptors. That is classic saturation strike logic applied at scale. It requires detailed intelligence about battery locations, magazine capacity, likely reload intervals, radar coverage, and command and control links. That kind of targeting picture is not assembled casually. It takes time, validation, and confidence. The strike on IDF Southern Command appears to have followed a deliberate sequence. According to the assessment in the transcript, radar and communications infrastructure supporting local defense were targeted first. Only after that degradation did the main effort concentrate on the hardened command facilities themselves. The logic is straightforward. A defense that sees less, communicates less, and processes more slowly makes worse decisions. Lower quality awareness translates into lower intercept rates. By the time the principal strike packages reach the core command complex, the local defense may already have been operating at a significant disadvantage. The 3 destroyed bases each represented a different category of military capability, and that distinction is critical to understanding the cumulative effect. The first base reportedly housed the primary armored logistics and maintenance infrastructure for the Gaza theater. That includes vehicle sustainment, ammunition flow, engineering support, and the maintenance backbone that keeps armored formations operating in a prolonged campaign. Without that infrastructure, armored force sustainability begins to erode quickly. Even capable frontline units cannot continue high-intensity operations for long if the maintenance and logistical machinery behind them has been disabled. The second base reportedly contained signals, intelligence, and electronic warfare assets central to Israeli operational awareness in the southern theater. Those capabilities include communications, monitoring, geolocation, disruption of adversary command links, and the broader invisible architecture that improves tactical decision-making across the battlefield. When those systems disappear, the damage is not always immediately visible from a distance, but the effects surface fast in the quality of targeting, situational awareness, and command responsiveness. Replacing hardware is only part of the problem. Restoring trained crews, databases, and integrated workflows is far more difficult. The third base was described as a forward airfield support complex. Hardened shelters, fuel storage, munitions handling, maintenance infrastructure, and ground support systems were concentrated there. If that account is accurate, its loss would force rotary and fixed-wing assets to operate from greater distances, with higher fuel burdens and shorter useful presence over target areas. That matters because operational tempo is built on proximity, fuel, maintenance, and rapid turnaround. Once those conditions degrade, aviation remains available in theory, but becomes less efficient, less responsive, and more vulnerable in practice. The cumulative effect of losing all three categories at once is far greater than the sum of the individual losses. A force that loses logistics, intelligence support, and forward aviation infrastructure at the same time does not suffer three isolated problems. It enters a compounding coordination crisis. The systems that would normally compensate for one damaged function may themselves already be impaired. Every hour after such a strike can become more difficult than the hour before, especially in an active theater where operations continue under pressure. The technology story behind this attack also matters, because public narratives about Iranian military capability have often lagged behind what the program was actually producing. Iran's missile development accelerated during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when Iraqi ballistic missile strikes against Iranian cities helped shape a long-term strategic decision in Tehran. The conclusion was that Iran needed an indigenous long-range strike capability that sanctions and embargoes could not easily shut down. That decision appears to have been maintained with unusual consistency across multiple Iranian administrations and through decades of external pressure. Programs with that level of continuity often produce outcomes that outside observers underestimate, especially when those observers focus more on restricted inputs than on real-world outputs. The EMAD represents a later generation of that effort, one associated with improved guidance precision. Earlier Iranian ballistic missiles were often understood as area weapons, effective against broad targets, but not necessarily specific points inside hardened military compounds. The strike results described in the transcript suggest a different level of performance. The circular error probable indicated by those impacts points to a guidance system refined through repeated improvement, likely supported by more than laboratory testing alone. The maneuvering reentry vehicle is especially important in this context. Russia has possessed related capabilities for decades, and China has fielded them as well. What stands out here is not that the technology exists globally, but that Iran appears to have achieved it with enough reliability to use it in a large operational strike. That is not a trivial threshold. Demonstrating a capability in theory is one thing. Committing it to a 500 missile attack against defended targets is something else entirely. Now consider the defensive side with the same level of seriousness. Arrow 3 is designed for exo-atmospheric interception of long-range ballistic threats, ideally engaging them before re-entry. It is a highly capable system, but it still has finite launch capacity, finite reload speed, and finite coverage at any given moment. David's Sling fills the mid-tier role, built for medium-range ballistic threats and larger rocket attacks. Patriot PAC-3 handles terminal layer defense against shorter-range threats and certain aircraft. Together, these systems form a layered architecture that has been widely presented as a leading model of modern missile defense. But even advanced layered defense has limits. Against a large, well-structured salvo attack, timed to exploit engagement windows and reload constraints, those limits can become decisive. Once magazines begin running short, defensive systems must prioritize. And prioritization under saturation pressure is brutal. Some tracks get engaged first, some are held for later, some are assessed as lower probability threats, and some may simply arrive at the exact moment when the system's capacity is already strained. If that is what happened last night, then the missiles that got through were not random survivors. They were likely the product of planning that anticipated how and where pressure on the defense would produce selective gaps. The implications extend beyond Israel. The United States has long promoted layered missile defense as a central answer to regional ballistic threats. Allies from East Asia to the Gulf to parts of Europe have built planning assumptions around American-backed defensive systems and the confidence those systems are meant to project. Those governments will study this strike carefully. They will not only ask what happened in southern Israel, they will ask what it reveals about the real-world resilience of missile defense under sustained, intelligently structured attack. And Iran's arsenal is not limited to the EMAD. The Khyber-Shekan has already drawn attention for improved performance in earlier operations. The Fatah is associated with Iran's move into the hypersonic glide category, a class of weapons that presents a different and more difficult interception problem because of speed, maneuverability, and lower altitude flight behavior. The Zulfiqar series adds another range tier and another set of targeting options. In other words, what was used last night appears to have been one part of a broader missile portfolio built to pressure multiple defensive vulnerabilities across multiple engagement zones. That raises a difficult planning question. If 500 EMD missiles produced this level of effect, what would a mixed package strike using several missile families do against a defense already dealing with depleted magazines, damaged radar support, and disrupted command infrastructure? That is not an abstract question. It is the kind of question military planners on all sides will be asking immediately. Washington's response so far follows a pattern familiar to anyone who has watched strategic institutions absorb a shock. Public language becomes more declaratory at the same moment. Real options become more constrained. Statements of support grow firmer, while internally, the operational and political costs of escalation become harder to ignore. Calls for de-escalation increase, often because leverage is more limited than public messaging suggests. The administration has confirmed support for Israel, condemned the attack, and announced additional defensive deployments. What it has not yet offered is a coherent, strategic explanation of what this event means for the military balance in the crew theater. The carrier strike group in the Eastern Mediterranean remains the most visible symbol of American commitment. But clarity matters here. A carrier strike group is an exceptionally powerful conventional tool. It can project air power, maintain presence, support maritime operations, and send a strong political signal. What it cannot do is reverse, by its mere presence, the destruction already inflicted on hardened military infrastructure. Nor does its deployment guarantee deterrence if the adversary has already chosen to absorb the signal and proceed anyway. That is one of the starkest facts of this crisis. The carrier was there, the strike still happened. Regional governments will notice that. So will American allies elsewhere. They will interpret it not as proof that American power has vanished, but as evidence that visible presence alone no longer guarantees strategic restraint from determined adversaries. The constraints on American escalation are real. A direct strike on Iranian territory would carry serious risk, and that risk now appears higher than it did before this attack. American forces are present across Iraq, Syria, the Gulf, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Every one of those positions becomes more exposed in a widening conflict. If last night demonstrated anything, it is that Iranian retaliatory capability has to be assessed at a higher level than many public narratives previously allowed. There's also a deeper strategic problem. For years, American Middle East policy rested on a core assumption that Israeli military strength, backed by American commitment, created a deterrent strong enough to prevent exactly this kind of attack on major military infrastructure. That assumption has now been challenged in the most visible possible way. Another assumption has also been shaken, that Iranian precision strike capability could not defeat the defensive systems protecting Israel's most critical military facilities with this degree of reliability. When foundational assumptions fail publicly, strategy cannot simply be adjusted around the edges. It has to be re-examined at the base level. That process is never quick. It requires institutions to identify where intelligence estimates fell short, where procurement assumptions proved optimistic, where deployment patterns became predictable, and where political messaging began to outpace operational reality. The next 72 hours will be especially revealing. They will show whether Washington moves toward a genuine strategic reassessment or falls back on familiar reflexes, louder signaling, broader reassurances, and descriptions of a structural failure as a temporary setback that resolve alone can fix. And then there is the question of will. Wars are not decided by hardware alone. Technology defines the range of the possible, but political commitment, institutional endurance, and public tolerance determine how much of that possible each side is willing to pay for. In that respect, much conventional Western analysis may be incomplete. From the Iranian perspective, the confrontation with the United States and Israel is framed as an existential struggle over sovereignty, autonomy, and strategic survival in a hostile environment. Sanctions, covert pressure, regional containment, and diplomatic isolation are experienced inside Iran, not as temporary policy disputes, but as parts of a sustained effort to weaken the state. Whether every element of that perception is objectively correct is not the point. The point is that the perception is real, widely shared, and politically powerful. It shapes institutional behavior over time. When engineers, missile planners, and launch crews believe their work is tied directly to national survival, the result can be a level of discipline and persistence that raw economic comparisons fail to capture. On the Israeli side, the picture is more complicated than military inventories alone suggest. Israel has demonstrated remarkable resilience across decades of war, but resilience does not erase strain. The current political climate has been marked by serious internal divisions, and those divisions matter in sustained military operations. The reserve system is one of the central pillars of Israeli military capacity in prolonged conflict. That system depends not only on patriotism and threat perception, but on social cohesion and confidence that sacrifice is both necessary and broadly shared. When political division deepens, economic disruption grows, and strategic direction becomes contested, hidden frictions begin to appear. They may show up in mobilization rates, retention, morale, readiness, or the erosion of less visible forms of institutional knowledge. Those effects are hard to measure in advance. They often become clear only once a long conflict is already underway. The United States faces its own challenge in the realm of political will. Public tolerance for extended military involvement in the Middle East has been declining for roughly 2 decades. The accumulated experience of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria left behind a broad skepticism about whether repeated regional intervention produces outcomes proportional to the cost in lives, money, and strategic focus. That skepticism is not marginal. It is a structural constraint on American policy. Iran understands that. Strategic patience has long been one of Tehran's most important assets. A state that believes it is fighting for survival and is prepared to absorb long-term costs often gains leverage over opponents whose political systems struggle to maintain public commitment over time. In that sense, time itself becomes a strategic resource. The implications of last night reach beyond the immediate battlefield and beyond the current news cycle. This event fits into a larger story, the gradual unwinding of the unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War, when American military and economic primacy was strong enough to organize much of the international system on broadly American terms. That period was never going to last forever. Unipolar systems generate resistance because they impose costs on others, and those others eventually seek ways to reduce dependence, increase autonomy, or openly contest the structure. What happened last night will be read globally as one more sign that a sanctioned regional power can now impose major military consequences on a key American ally despite a sophisticated, heavily financed defensive umbrella. In Moscow, the strategic conclusion is likely straightforward. Any crisis that absorbs American attention, military bandwidth, and political capital in the Middle East reduces pressure elsewhere. That advantage does not require dramatic Russian action. It emerges automatically from American overextension. For years, Moscow has operated on the assumption that the United States, by taking on global security obligations across multiple theaters, has committed itself to burdens that may eventually exceed its sustainable capacity. The events of the past year already pointed in that direction. Last night added to that pattern. Russia and Iran have also deepened ties in recent years through technology exchange, economic cooperation, and diplomatic alignment. That does not mean Moscow orchestrated the strike. It means Russia benefits from any demonstration that American-led pressure can be endured and that American-backed defensive systems can be challenged effectively. In Beijing, the reaction is likely to be more restrained in public, but no less significant in strategic terms. China has spent years offering an alternative vision for Middle East engagement, one centered more on economic partnership and diplomatic brokerage than on military alliance and explicit security guarantees. That model becomes more attractive when confidence in the American-led security architecture weakens. The Chinese brokered Saudi-Iran normalization in 2023 was an early sign of that trend. Gulf states are not abandoning the United States. Their military, financial, and political ties remain deep, but they are clearly widening their strategic options. That process of diversification is likely to accelerate after an event like this. When a premier American ally in the region loses 3 major military bases in a single night, every other partner begins reviewing assumptions. Europe will also be watching closely, though its reaction is shaped by its own geography, domestic politics, and security pressures. The broader lesson, however, is similar. Security systems built around American primacy are showing signs of strain in a world of simultaneous crises. That does not mean collapse. It does mean uncertainty. European governments are already wrestling with what sustainable security looks like if American strategic bandwidth is no longer sufficient to manage major challenges in multiple theaters at once with the same confidence it once projected. Across the global south, the lesson may be absorbed in a different way. Many states have spent years balancing between Western pressure and alternative relationships offered by China, Russia, and regional powers. They have repeatedly been told, explicitly or implicitly, that alignment with American-backed structures is the safest strategic choice because American protection is the most reliable. Last night complicates that argument. It adds a powerful new data point to the internal debates of governments from Ankara to Jakarta to Pretoria and beyond. At the same time, it is important not to overstate the speed of change. The United States remains the most capable military power in the world by conventional measures. Its alliance network is still extensive. The dollar remains the dominant reserve currency. These are durable pillars of power, and none of them disappears overnight. What changed last night was not the absolute level of American power. What changed was a perception of its reliability, reach, and deterrent credibility in a specific and highly visible test case. Perception matters in international politics because it shapes behavior. It influences procurement decisions, alliance hedging, diplomatic posture, and the quiet strategic calculations that eventually become major geopolitical shifts. The age of uncontested American military primacy in the Middle East did not end in one night. It has been eroding for years through a series of cumulative shocks, but this was not a minor increment. By the framing of the transcript, it may stand as one of the most consequential single shifts in that process since the invasion of Iraq in 2003 exposed the gap between rapid conventional victory and durable strategic success. That is why the most difficult questions now extend beyond damage assessment. If the defensive architecture built over decades and supported by enormous investment cannot reliably protect Israel's most critical military installations against a 500 missile strike from a sanctioned regional power, what does that imply for the credibility of American security guarantees elsewhere? Allies in the Pacific will ask that while watching China's expanding military power, states in Eastern Europe will ask it while assessing Russian pressure. Gulf monarchies will ask it while recalculating Iranian reach. Those questions do not produce easy answers, and once allies begin answering them privately, the effects accumulate over years in ways that reassurance alone rarely reverses. There is another question that matters just as much. The analysts, officials, and policymakers whose assessments helped shape expectations about Iranian capability are still inside the system. Many of the same institutions that underestimated the operational reliability of this missile force are now responsible for producing the next round of estimates that will drive the response. That does not mean their analysis is worthless. It does mean accountability matters. When strategic assessments fail on this scale, the necessary response is not cosmetic revision. It is a rigorous examination of how assumptions hardened into consensus, where contrary indicators were dismissed, and why warning signals did not alter planning in time. Without that kind of institutional honesty, the same analytical framework remains in place, only with updated language and fresh talking points. That is not adaptation, it is repetition. This situation will keep moving quickly. Decisions in Tel Aviv, Tehran, Washington, Moscow, and Beijing over the coming hours and days will shape whether this becomes the starting point for a new strategic equilibrium or the opening chapter of a much wider and more destructive confrontation. Both paths remain possible. What is already clear is that the world after last night is not identical to the world before it. A set of assumptions about deterrence, defense, and regional military balance has been tested in the harshest possible way, and the answers so far have not been reassuring. The immediate tactical picture matters. So do the damaged facilities, the failed intercepts, the missile technology, and the visible military consequences on the ground. But the larger significance lies in what those facts do to confidence, to alliance behavior, and to the strategic imagination of states that are watching from a distance. Those governments are paying close attention now. They are not only studying how 500 missiles were launched, how defenses were stressed, or how fast Washington responds. They are studying what this says about the future of deterrence, the limits of missile defense, and the risks of depending too heavily on guarantees that may be less absolute than they once appeared. That is the real strategic aftershock of last night. The battlefield damage can be measured in destroyed bases, broken infrastructure, and disrupted operations. The geopolitical damage is measured differently. It appears in doubt, in hedging, in recalculation, and in the quiet rewriting of strategic assumptions by capitals that may never say publicly what they have concluded privately. That process has already begun. And once it begins, it rarely stops because of a statement, a summit, or a symbolic deployment. It stops only if the underlying credibility is restored. Right now, that credibility is the central question hanging over this crisis.